The Arizona sun had already turned the morning air into a furnace when Thomas Garrett rode out to check the fence line on the eastern border of his struggling ranch. The year was 1876, and Tom had spent the last 3 years trying to prove that the land everyone called worthless could support a cattle operation. So far, he'd only proven that stubbornness and optimism weren't sufficient substitutes for adequate water and good grazing land. His well was running dry again, his small herd of cattle was getting thinner, and the bank in Tucson was starting to make uncomfortable noises about the loan that had allowed him to purchase the property in the first place. Tom had been warned before buying the ranch that this particular stretch of Arizona desert was too dry, too rocky, and too far from reliable water sources to support successful ranching. But the price had been right for a poor cowboy with big dreams and limited options, and Tom had convinced himself that hard work and careful management could overcome the land's natural limitations. 3 years of experience had taught him that nature didn't care much about human determination, but he was too invested to give up now. The figure lying motionless near a cluster of Palo Verde trees caught Tom's attention as he was repairing a section of fence damaged by wandering cattle. At first he thought it might be a dead animal, but as he rode closer, he could see it was a person. An elderly man wearing traditional Apache clothing collapsed in the meager shade provided by the desert vegetation. Tom dismounted quickly and knelt beside the man, checking for signs of life and finding a weak pulse and shallow breathing that suggested severe dehydration. Tom's own water situation was precarious enough that sharing supplies was a serious decision rather than an easy gesture of charity. His canteen held perhaps a day's worth of water, and the ride back to his ranch house would take several hours under the punishing sun. But looking at the old man's cracked lips and sunken features, Tom didn't hesitate. He carefully lifted the elder's head and began administering small sips of water, knowing that too much too quickly could be as dangerous as continued dehydration. Over the next hour, as Tom continued sharing his water and moving the old man into better shade, the Apache elder gradually revived enough to open his eyes and focus on his rescuer's face. The gratitude in those ancient eyes was unmistakable, but there was something else as well, something that looked like recognition mixed with relief, as if the old man had been searching for someone specific and had finally found them. When he spoke, his voice was weak but clear, and his English was surprisingly fluent for someone who appeared to have spent most of his life living according to traditional Apache ways. "You are Thomas Garrett," the elder said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, the one they call the fool cowboy, who bought land that holds no water. Tom was surprised that this stranger knew his name and reputation, but he simply nodded, too concerned about the old man's condition to worry about how such information might have traveled across the territory. The elder managed a slight smile and continued, "I am Chaska. I have been waiting for someone like you, though I did not expect to meet you in this manner." Chaska explained that he had been traveling to Tom's ranch deliberately, hoping to arrive before his age, and declining health made the journey impossible. He had heard stories about the young white rancher who treated Apache people with respect when they crossed his property, who never shot at them or reported their presence to the cavalry patrols that still sometimes hunted native people in the region. More importantly, Chaska had observed Tom's treatment of the land itself, noting that even when facing failure, the young rancher hadn't resorted to the destructive overgrazing and well drilling that many settlers employed when trying to force the desert to produce beyond its natural capacity. As Tom helped Chaska onto his horse for the long ride back to the ranch house, the old man said something that would echo in Tom's mind for the rest of his life. "The land you call worthless holds secrets that could make you wealthy beyond your dreams, Thomas Garrett. But first, you must understand why those secrets have been kept and what responsibilities come with knowing them. I am the last keeper of knowledge that has sustained my people for generations. Before I die, I must pass this knowledge to someone who will honor it properly." The ride back to the ranch seemed longer than usual, with Tom's mind racing through questions about what Chaska meant and why this Apache elder had chosen to share mysterious knowledge with a struggling cowboy who was barely keeping his operation alive. As they approached the small adobe ranch house that Tom had built with his own hands, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine, and that the simple act of sharing water with a stranger would lead to revelations that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the land he'd been trying so desperately to tame. Over the next 3 days, as Chaska recovered his strength in the spare room of Tom's modest ranch house, the Apache elder began to reveal knowledge that transformed the young rancher's understanding of the apparently barren land he'd been struggling to make productive. The secret wasn't that the land lacked water, but rather that the water existed in places and forms that most settlers would never recognize. Without guidance from those who had learned to read the desert's subtle signs over generations of careful observation, Chaska explained that beneath the rocky surface of Tom's property ran a network of underground streams and aquifers that were part of a complex hydrological system extending across much of southern Arizona. These weren't the kind of obvious water sources that settlers typically looked for when choosing ranch land, but rather deep channels that flowed through limestone and sandstone formations, sometimes hundreds of feet below the surface. Apache people had known about these hidden water sources for centuries, using them to sustain communities in areas that white settlers considered uninhabitable. The knowledge of how to locate and access these underground rivers had been carefully guarded by designated keepers within Apache communities, passed down through specific family lines that had developed sophisticated techniques for interpreting geological signs, seasonal patterns, and even the behavior of certain plants and animals that indicated the presence of water below. Chaska was the last living member of his family line, and with no children or relatives who had survived the conflicts and diseases that had devastated Apache populations in recent decades, he faced the prospect of allowing this precious knowledge to die with him. What made Tom's property particularly valuable, according to Chaska's explanation, was its location at a convergence point where several underground water channels came together before continuing south toward Mexico. The elder drew detailed diagrams in the dirt of Tom's yard, showing how the water flowed through different geological layers and where specific points of access could be established without damaging the overall system. The patterns Chaska described matched features Tom had noticed but never understood. Certain areas where vegetation grew more vigorously, subtle temperature differences in rocks at different locations, and even the flight patterns of birds during certain seasons. But as Chaska shared this revolutionary information, he also emphasized the responsibilities that came with such knowledge. The underground water system wasn't an unlimited resource to be exploited without consequence. It was a delicate balance that had been maintained through careful use by Apache communities who understood that overuse in one location could affect water availability across the entire region. The elder explained that previous generations had developed strict protocols for how much water could be drawn from different access points, how to monitor the system's health, and how to recognize signs that usage needed to be reduced to prevent permanent damage. Tom found himself facing a moral complexity he hadn't anticipated when he'd shared his canteen with a dying stranger. The knowledge Chaska was offering could indeed transform his struggling ranch into a prosperous operation, but it came with the weight of stewardship for a resource that extended far beyond his property boundaries. The underground water system sustained not just Tom's land but also the remaining Apache communities in the region, wildlife populations, and even distant ranches and settlements, whose occupants had no idea they depended on the same hidden aquifers. The question that kept Tom awake at night as he absorbed Chaska's teachings was whether he possessed the wisdom and integrity to use this knowledge responsibly. The temptation to simply drill wells at the optimal locations and maximize his ranch's productivity was powerful, especially given his desperate financial situation. But Chaska had chosen to share this information precisely because he believed Tom was different from the settlers, who viewed the land purely as a resource to be exploited for personal profit. The evening of the third day, as Chaska's health continued to improve thanks to Tom's care and the rest the elder desperately needed, the old Apache man revealed why he had specifically sought out Tom, rather than simply letting the knowledge die with him. Chaska had been observing Tom's ranch for nearly a year, watching how the young cowboy treated not just the land, but also the occasional Apache families who passed through the area, the wildlife that competed with his cattle for scarce resources, and even the plants and soil that he was trying to coax into productivity. You have shown respect when no one was watching. Thomas Garrett, Chaska said as they sat on the porch watching the desert sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. You have failed to make your ranch profitable, but you have not failed in the ways that matter most. You have not poisoned waterholes to keep away animals you considered competitors. You have not shot at Apache people for the crime of crossing land you claim as yours. You have not torn up the desert vegetation in anger when it did not produce what you wanted. These small acts of respect have been noticed, and they have earned you something more valuable than gold. As Chaska began describing the specific locations on Tom's property where access points to the underground water could be established, Tom realized he was receiving not just practical information, but a sacred trust. The knowledge the elder was sharing represented generations of accumulated wisdom about living sustainably in a harsh environment, and the responsibility to use it properly would define the rest of Tom's life and determine whether Chaska's decision to trust him had been wise or foolish. The transformation of Tom's understanding about his property began with a walk that would have seemed pointless to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. Chaska, now recovered enough to move slowly across the desert terrain, led Tom to a seemingly unremarkable section of the ranch where scrub brush and rocky outcroppings created a landscape that looked no different from 1,000 other places in the Arizona desert. But as the elder began pointing out subtle details that Tom had passed by hundreds of times without truly seeing, a hidden pattern emerged that revealed the presence of water far below the surface. Chaska taught Tom to recognize the specific species of plants that only grew where their deep roots could reach underground moisture, explaining how the distribution and health of these indicator species could map the flow of subterranean streams with remarkable precision. He showed Tom how certain rocks held warmth differently depending on whether water flowed beneath them, and how subtle changes in soil color and texture revealed the depth and direction of underground channels. Most remarkably, Chaska demonstrated how seasonal changes in the behavior of local wildlife, from the nesting patterns of certain birds to the migration routes of desert animals, reflected their knowledge of hidden water sources. The first practical application of Chaska's knowledge came when Tom, following the elder's detailed instructions, began excavating at a location that would have seemed like the worst possible place to dig a well, according to conventional ranching wisdom. The site was on elevated ground, where logic suggested any water would have long since drained away. But Chaska explained that the geological formation beneath that spot created a natural reservoir where underground streams pooled before continuing their hidden journey south. The rocks beneath the surface were arranged in layers that formed a cathedral-like chamber, protecting the water from evaporation and maintaining its purity. The moment when Tom's shovel broke through to the chamber Chaska had described was one of the most profound experiences of his ranching career. The water that flowed into the excavation was cool, clear, and abundant, representing not just the solution to his immediate problems, but proof that everything the Apache elder had taught him was based on genuine understanding rather than hopeful speculation. But even as Tom felt the exhilaration of discovering such a resource on his supposedly worthless property, he remembered Chaska's warnings about the responsibilities that came with this knowledge. Under the elder's guidance, Tom learned to construct an access point that would allow him to draw water for his ranch's needs while preserving the integrity of the underground system. Instead of drilling a conventional well that might disrupt the delicate balance of pressures and flows beneath the surface, they created a spring-fed system that worked with the natural hydrology rather than against it. Chaska showed Tom how to build collection pools that would fill during periods of peak flow and provide reserves during drier seasons, essentially mimicking the way Apache communities had managed these resources for generations. As word began to spread through the territory that Tom Garrett's ranch suddenly had reliable water where none had existed before, curious neighbors and potential business partners started appearing at his property with questions about his methods and offers to help him expand his operation. Tom found himself facing the first real test of his commitment to honoring Chaska's trust, as the pressure to share or sell his supposed discovery came from people who had no understanding of the sacred knowledge that made it possible and no commitment to the responsible stewardship that such knowledge required. The situation became more complicated when a representative from a large cattle company arrived with an offer to buy Tom's ranch at a price that would solve all his financial problems and make him wealthier than he'd ever imagined possible. The buyer claimed to have heard about Tom's lucky strike of underground water and wanted to develop the property into a major ranching operation that could support thousands of cattle. The offer was tempting, especially given Tom's mounting debts and the years of struggle he'd endured trying to make the ranch viable, but accepting it would mean abandoning his responsibility to protect the knowledge and resources that Chaska had entrusted to him. That evening, sitting with Chaska on the porch as they had done so many times since the elder's arrival, Tom spoke honestly about his doubts and temptations. The old Apache man listened patiently, then shared a story about his own grandfather, who had once been offered great wealth by Mexican silver miners in exchange for revealing the locations of hidden water sources that could supply their mining operations. His grandfather had refused, understanding that such exploitation would devastate not just the immediate area, but the entire interconnected system that sustained life across the region. The question you must ask yourself, Thomas Garrett, Chaska said as the desert stars began appearing in the darkening sky, is not whether you can profit from this knowledge, but whether you can be trusted to preserve it for those who will come after you. Wealth that destroys the source of its creation is not wealth at all, but merely theft from the future. You must decide whether you are a steward or a thief, because you cannot be both. The morning after Tom declined the cattle company's generous offer to purchase his ranch, he discovered that refusing temptation had consequences more complicated than he'd anticipated. The company representative, a hard-faced businessman named Harrison Burke, didn't simply accept Tom's refusal and move on to other opportunities. Instead, Burke began spreading rumors throughout the territory that Tom was sitting on valuable water resources while his neighbors struggled with drought, suggesting that the young rancher's selfishness was harming the entire community's prospects for prosperity. The rumors found fertile ground among settlers who had been watching Tom's sudden access to reliable water with a mixture of envy and curiosity. Some genuinely believed that if Tom had discovered underground water on his property, similar resources might exist beneath their own land if they could just learn his techniques. Others were more cynical, suspecting that Tom had stumbled onto something valuable that he was trying to keep for himself while pretending to be a simple, struggling rancher. The social pressure to share his secret or sell to someone who would develop the resources more aggressively began affecting Tom's relationships. Throughout the region, Chaska observed these developments with the patient wisdom of someone who had seen similar patterns repeat throughout his long life. He explained to Tom that the test of character wasn't simply whether he would refuse to misuse the sacred knowledge, but whether he could maintain that integrity when faced with social isolation, economic pressure, and the accusation that his principles were actually selfishness disguised as virtue. The elder had seen many people make correct initial choices only to gradually compromise their values when the costs of maintaining those choices became clear. The situation escalated when Tom's bank called in his loan, citing concerns about his erratic business decisions and refusal to maximize the potential value of his property. Burke had clearly been working behind the scenes to create financial pressure that would force Tom to either sell the ranch or reveal how he had accessed the underground water. Without the loan extension Tom desperately needed, he faced the prospect of losing everything he'd worked for, despite now having access to the water resources that could make the ranch genuinely profitable. If given time to develop properly, Tom found himself spending sleepless nights weighing his options and questioning whether his commitment to honoring Chaska's trust was actually wisdom or merely stubborn pride dressed up as principle. He could probably negotiate a sale to Burke that would pay off his debts and leave him with enough money to start over somewhere else, free from the responsibilities and pressures that came with Chaska's sacred knowledge. Or he could try to find alternative financing and accept the social isolation that came with refusing to share or commercialize what his neighbors increasingly viewed as community resources rather than personal knowledge. The turning point came from an unexpected direction when a group of Apache families who had been camping in the hills near Tom's ranch, sent a representative to speak with him. The young Apache man, who introduced himself as Chaska's distant relative, explained that word of the elder's presence at Tom's ranch and his decision to share the sacred water knowledge had spread through native communities in the region. Some Apache people were concerned that such knowledge should never have been shared with a white settler, while others understood Chaska's reasoning and wanted to offer their support to Tom's efforts to honor that trust properly. The representative brought a message from Apache elders who had been discussing Tom's situation and the broader implications of Chaska's decision. They proposed a formal agreement that would acknowledge Tom's stewardship of the water sources on his property, while establishing protocols that would ensure the knowledge was used responsibly and that the benefits were shared appropriately with all communities that depended on the underground water system. In exchange for Tom's commitment to these principles, the Apache communities would provide assistance with his ranch operations and help him resist the economic and social pressure to commercialize or sell the water resources. This proposal offered Tom a path forward that he hadn't previously seen, a way to maintain his principles while also building a sustainable operation and establishing relationships that could protect both the land and the sacred knowledge that Chaska had entrusted to him. But accepting it would mean formally aligning himself with Apache communities at a time when such associations could bring even more trouble from territorial authorities and aggressive settlers who viewed native people primarily as obstacles to development, rather than as potential partners in sustainable resource management. Tom spent an entire day riding the boundaries of his property, thinking about everything that had happened since he'd found Chaska collapsed near the fence line. The elder had given him not just information about hidden water sources, but a deeper education about the relationship between people and land, about the difference between using resources and honoring them, and about the responsibilities that came with knowledge that could affect far more than just his personal circumstances. The question wasn't really whether Tom should accept the Apache community's offer, but whether he had the courage to continue down the path that had begun with sharing his canteen with a dying stranger. That evening, Tom gave his answer to Chaska's relative, formally accepting the protocols and responsibilities that would govern his use of the underground water sources. The decision meant giving up any possibility of selling the ranch for a windfall profit and accepting that his operation would always be constrained by considerations beyond mere economic efficiency. But it also meant joining something larger than himself, becoming part of a tradition of stewardship that had sustained life in the Arizona desert for generations before his arrival and would hopefully continue for generations after his time had passed. The formal agreement between Tom and the Apache communities transformed his struggling ranch in ways that went far beyond simply having reliable access to water. Within weeks of accepting the stewardship protocols, Tom found his operations supported by a network of knowledge and practical assistance that made up for his inexperience with desert ranching and his limited financial resources. Apache families who had been observing his ranch from a distance began visiting openly, bringing expertise about which native grasses would provide the best forage for his cattle, how to recognize and prevent overgrazing before it damaged the delicate desert ecosystem, and which traditional techniques could help him build infrastructure using local materials rather than expensive lumber shipped from distant forests. The education Tom received from his Apache partners revealed how little he had understood about the land he'd been trying to work for 3 years. The desert that had seemed harsh and unproductive to his settlers' eyes was actually rich with resources for those who knew how to recognize and utilize them properly. Native plants that he'd viewed as worthless brush turned out to have practical uses ranging from natural fencing materials to medicinal herbs that could treat common cattle ailments. Seasonal patterns that he'd never noticed became predictable guides for when to move livestock to different areas of his property, and weather signs that he'd ignored as superstition proved to be remarkably accurate indicators of coming conditions. But the most valuable aspect of the alliance wasn't the practical knowledge or even the water access that had started everything. It was the fundamental shift in how Tom understood his relationship to the land he'd purchased. He'd arrived in Arizona thinking of himself as someone who would tame and develop a piece of wilderness, imposing his will on nature through hard work and determination. The Apache worldview that Chaska and his relatives introduced showed Tom that successful ranching in the desert required working with the land's natural patterns rather than against them, accepting the limitations that ecological reality imposed while finding opportunities within those constraints. The success of Tom's ranch under the new stewardship model began attracting attention that went beyond the initial rumors about his water access. Other struggling ranchers, watching his cattle grow healthier and his property become more productive without the massive investments in wells and irrigation that conventional wisdom suggested were necessary, started asking questions about his methods. Tom found himself becoming an unlikely advocate for sustainable ranching practices, explaining to skeptical neighbors that respecting the land's limits didn't mean accepting failure, but rather understanding how to succeed within realistic parameters. The challenges to this new approach came from multiple directions, as both territorial authorities and commercial interests viewed Tom's alliance with Apache communities as potentially threatening to the prevailing model of frontier development. Harrison Burke, the cattle company representative who had tried to buy Tom's ranch, escalated his efforts to discredit the young rancher, now claiming that Tom's cooperation with native people violated the spirit, if not the letter, of territorial laws designed to keep Apache populations confined to designated areas. Some local officials, pressured by Burke's company and other commercial interests, began investigating whether Tom's arrangements constituted illegal support for People B, who were supposed to be under military supervision. The crisis came when territorial marshals arrived at Tom's ranch with orders to cease his cooperation with Apache families and document the locations of his water sources for government records. The stated justification was resource management and public safety, but Tom understood that the real goal was to take control of the underground water system so that commercial interests could exploit it without the constraints that his stewardship agreement imposed. Refusing the marshal's orders would mean legal consequences that could cost him his property and possibly his freedom, but complying would mean betraying the trust that Chaska had placed in him and violating the agreements that had made his ranch viable. Tom's response to this crisis demonstrated how much he had grown from the desperate, struggling rancher who had shared his canteen with a dying Apache elder. Instead of simply refusing the marshal's demands or passively accepting their authority, he used the documentation that the stewardship agreement had established to demonstrate that his water access was part of a legal arrangement with Apache communities that predated territorial claims to the region. With support from Apache elders who testified about the traditional use and management of the underground water system, Tom argued that his stewardship role actually fulfilled territorial responsibilities for resource management more effectively than the commercial exploitation that Burke's company proposed. The legal arguments that followed would take months to resolve through territorial courts and federal offices, but they established important precedents about native resource rights and the validity of traditional knowledge in land management decisions. Tom's case became part of a broader discussion about how the American West would be developed, and whether there was room for approaches that honored indigenous wisdom about sustainable resource use rather than simply displacing native peoples and exploiting natural resources until they were exhausted. Through all these challenges, Chaska remained at Tom's ranch as both advisor and symbol of the alliance between settler and native approaches to living in the Arizona desert. The elder's health had stabilized with proper care and regular access to water, and he spent his days teaching anyone who would listen about the interconnections between different aspects of the desert ecosystem and the responsibilities that came with understanding those relationships. His presence at the ranch became a bridge between communities that had historically viewed each other with suspicion and hostility, showing that cooperation was possible even in a region where conflict had seemed inevitable. 3 years after Tom Garrett had found Chaska collapsed near his fence line, the supposedly worthless ranch had become something unprecedented in the Arizona territory, a successful demonstration that sustainable ranching could be both economically viable and ecologically responsible. When guided by traditional indigenous knowledge combined with thoughtful adaptation of settler techniques, the underground water system that Chaska had revealed continued to support Tom's operation, while also sustaining Apache communities and wildlife populations throughout the region, proving that resources carefully managed could benefit multiple stakeholders without being exhausted or degraded. The legal battles that had threatened to destroy Tom's stewardship arrangement eventually resulted in territorial recognition of traditional Apache water rights and the validity of knowledge-based resource management systems. The precedents established through Tom's case influenced policy decisions across the Southwest, encouraging other experimental arrangements that sought to balance development needs with ecological sustainability and respect for indigenous expertise. While progress was uneven and resistance from commercial interests remained strong, the possibility of alternative approaches to frontier development had been established in ways that would shape the region's future. Tom's ranch had expanded modestly, never becoming the massive commercial operation that Burke's company had envisioned, but achieving a level of prosperity and stability that seemed impossible during those desperate early years. His cattle herd was healthy and productive, his water sources were reliable and properly managed, and his reputation had shifted from fool cowboy to respected rancher, whose methods were being studied by others facing similar challenges with marginal lands. More importantly, his property had become a gathering place where settlers and Apache families could interact in ways that reduced misunderstanding and built relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests. Chaska had lived to see the success of his decision to trust Tom with the sacred knowledge of the underground water system. The elder spent his final years teaching a new generation about the responsibilities of stewardship, training both Apache youth and interested settler children in the traditional techniques for reading the desert's subtle signs and understanding the connections between different aspects of the ecosystem. When Chaska passed away peacefully in his sleep at Tom's ranch, his funeral brought together people from across the territory who had been touched by his wisdom and his example of bridging cultural divides through patient education and trust. The legacy that Chaska left extended far beyond the specific knowledge about underground water that he had shared with Tom. His deeper gift was demonstrating that traditional indigenous wisdom about sustainable resource use wasn't primitive superstition to be dismissed by modern settlers, but rather sophisticated understanding developed over generations of careful observation and adaptation to challenging environments. The techniques that Apache people had developed for living successfully in the Arizona desert without exhausting its resources represented exactly the kind of knowledge that white settlers needed if they hoped to build lasting communities rather than temporary extraction operations. Tom had become the keeper of this knowledge, not as its owner but as its steward, responsible for passing it on to others who could be trusted to honor it properly. He established a teaching program at his ranch that welcomed anyone genuinely interested in learning sustainable ranching techniques adapted to desert conditions. Some of his students were white settlers looking for alternatives to the boom and bust cycles of conventional frontier development, while others were Apache young people seeking to preserve traditional knowledge while adapting it to changing circumstances. The combination of perspectives created a unique educational environment that honored the past while preparing for the future. The underground water system that had started, everything continued to flow beneath Tom's property and across the broader region, supporting life in ways that most people would never directly observe or understand. But those who learned to read the desert's signs could see the evidence of that hidden abundance in the health of vegetation, the presence of wildlife, and the prosperity of communities that had learned to work with natural patterns rather than fighting against them. The network of springs and streams that Tom maintained, according to Chaska's teachings, became part of a larger vision of what the American West could be if development was guided by wisdom and respect rather than simple exploitation. As Tom stood at Chaska's grave, site on a hill overlooking the ranch, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in colors that never failed to move him, he thought about the journey that had begun with sharing water with a dying stranger. That simple act of compassion had led to revelations that transformed not just his ranch, but his entire understanding of what it meant to live successfully in a challenging environment. The land that everyone had called worthless had proven to hold treasures beyond measure, but accessing those treasures had required learning to see with different eyes, and to value knowledge that his culture had too often dismissed or ignored. The secret that Chaska had shared wasn't really about hidden water sources or underground rivers, though those physical realities were certainly important. The deeper secret was that lasting prosperity came not from conquering the land or forcing it to produce beyond its natural capacity, but from understanding and working within the patterns that sustained life over generations. The Apache people had known this truth for centuries, and by sharing it with Tom, Chaska had offered white settlers an alternative to the destructive approaches that were already showing their limitations across the American frontier. As darkness settled over the desert and stars began appearing in the vast Arizona sky, Tom made a silent promise to the elder who had trusted him with so much. He would continue the work of stewardship, teaching others about the responsibilities that came with knowledge and resources, and building on the foundation that Chaska had laid for cooperation between communities that needed each other more than they realized. The water would continue to flow, hidden beneath the surface but sustaining life wherever people had learned to honor it properly, and the legacy of the dying Apache elder, who had shared his people's most precious secrets, would live on through everyone who learned to see the desert not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a teacher offering lessons about how to live wisely in a world of limits and possibilities.